The Terry series is a unique gem between JRPGs. Contrary to other classic franchises which maintain little to no connection between entries, every Trace game takes place within the same continuity, building upon each other as they develop one of the deepest, most complex worlds in gaming. This ever-increasing pile of games can be a daunting prospect for new players, not to mention confusing, as the series' naming scheme does not maintain a clear, easy-to-understand order. And so, way too often, we hear the same old question. Where should I start? The answers inevitably fall within one of three camps. You could start with the original Trails in the Sky trilogy to understand the full context behind a bunch of characters and organizations vital to the series, Old Steel if you are somehow allergic to 2D graphics, or Trails from Zero if you want to understand just what the hell is going on in the later Old Steel games. Trails in the Sky, the first chapter, is for all intents and purposes Nihon Falcom's answer to that question, recreating the original story in the shiny new Daybreak engine with all of the graphical and gameplay improvements that it entails. The original first chapter design slots smoothly into the modern Trails style. Every character and monster, every environment from towns and dungeons to the entire liberal wilderness, every animation in battles and cutscenes is fully reimagined in glorious 3D and yet retains the same look and feel of the original. A credit to the franchise and its developers who, throughout all these years, managed to preserve the same core aesthetics and gameplay between entries, continuously updating them, sure, but never losing sight of their origins. There are changes, of course, but they are additive rather than transformative. Towns seem a lot busier with dozens of extra NPCs, party members have tons of new, voice-acted conversations that fill the silence as they travel together, and a few new side quests provide extra screen time for some of the minor characters. Meanwhile, Estelle and Joshua's adventures around Liberal and all of the deep political and interpersonal dramas that develop around them, and for which the Trail series is famous for, are exactly the same as the original game, and honestly, for a remake, that's the best outcome I would ever hope for. With one slight exception, that is. You see, the original English version was translated and published by Exceed Games, while Gung-Ho was responsible for the remake's localization, retranslating the entire script from scratch, which means that even though the original Japanese script remains largely the same, there are countless differences in style and terminology between the two games' English versions. This brings us to a curious state of affairs. Many anime and JRPG fans dislike it when localizers take too many creative liberties translating Japanese words into English, which Exceed definitely did, but on the other hand, countless Western Trails fans fell in love with the series partly because of Exceed's localization work. People who idolized the writing style, for example, their portrayal of Estelle. To the former, Gung-Ho's version comes as a long-awaited fix to Exceed's excesses, while to the latter, it's a drier, sterile interpretation that strips off much of the charm of the original. Of course, that's just another flare-up in a much larger controversy that's been going on for far too long, and I'm not going to pretend I hold any solutions, but I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention it as a potential issue, depending on which camp you may fall. The addition of voice acting, on the other hand, is a definite improvement, bringing extra emotional depth to the dialogue, especially in cutscenes where the animation department decided to go all out. I chose the Japanese VAs for my playthrough, but I watched all the major scenes in English too to have an idea of their performances, and I can confidently say I enjoyed both versions, especially Matt Mercer's rendition of Amber Amour, which doesn't in any way lose to his Japanese counterpart.
Their paths like a beacon guiding me straight to you.
Also, on the matter of voice acting, many of the dialogues are only partially voiced, by which I mean some of the actors are voice acted, while others are completely unvoiced throughout the same conversation, which I found to be a jarring breach of immersion. Of course, I understand and respect the fact that dubbing the game in its entirety was outside the scope of the project, but personally, I believe this weird hybrid solution to be worse than these things having no voice acting at all.
そこの嬢ちゃんたちがカシウスの子供たちというわけか。
The biggest changes by far though are in terms of gameplay. For starters, there are many quality of life improvements like a highly detailed map that points you to objectives, collectibles, treasure chests and the like, an easily identifiable marker above NPCs you can talk to, which updates whenever they have something new to say, and a myriad of other small UI improvements too numerous to mention. The combat gameplay has been heavily modernized, though it still retains its ore. You'll find the developers brought along most of the improvements made within the last 20 years of sequels, like for example the burst mechanic introduced in Trails to Azure, the stun and real-time battle mechanics as they appeared in Trails to Daybreak, a complete rebalance of quartz and arts in terms of power, status effects and EP cost, tweaks to the AT bonuses and more. Overall, it's a much more responsive, dynamic battle system and I enjoyed it a lot, though with some reservations. First, even though some of those tweaks also empower enemy bosses, I found the Trails remake to be far easier than the original, even in the Nightmare difficulty. The ease with which I would juggle delays, stuns and other status effects to negate my enemies' turns gave me flashbacks to my Magic the Gathering days, when someone in my friend group had this overpowered blue deck that completely shut down everybody else no matter what we tried. It sucked out the fun of the later fights as even the final boss barely had a chance to attack me, and when he did I could easily heal my party back to full in a single turn. Second, that was my first experience with the real-time combat mechanics, as I haven't yet played Trails to Daybreak, and to be honest, I found it tedious and lacking in depth. All I ended up doing was abusing the overly generous dodge roll to recharge my craft bar and spam triangle until I filled an enemy's stun bar to get the battle advantage bonus. The sheer amount of time needed to stun the mini-boss enemies was especially aggravating, and I found myself missing Old Steel's far snappier system. A fun observation to make though is how the developers have been careful to maintain lore consistency with those mechanical improvements, by not including systems that are expressly presented in-game as a technological advance that did not exist as of the time of the events of Trails in the Sky, such as the Master Arts, Dual Arts and the like. We're still very much in the pocket watch era of the Herbal Revolution, and I find it worthy of note that the developers had the sense not to try and jam all those mechanics in anyway, and then the consequences. Speaking of consequences, modern recreations are, of course, accompanied by modern business practices, which is to say a veritable smorgasbord of silly cosmetics and cheat items, 67 of them in fact, almost all of which sold as microtransactions. Falcom has been doing this kind of thing at least since Old Steel, and I'm guilty as charged of engaging with it on occasion, but the base game costs the standard $60, a much fairer price than some other companies have been charging for their games in the recent past, and these microtransactions are entirely optional. In fact, as easy as the base game is, even on the highest difficulties, I'd argue the cheat items would only suck out any last remnant of a challenge the game might hold, at which point you may as well just put it on easy mode instead. Some of the cosmetics do look pretty nice though, and I don't regret buying them. As for performance, the game runs phenomenally well on my 5070 Ti, to the point where I would easily lock my frame rate to 120 FPS in 1440p with maxed out settings, and still have performance to spare. Your mileage may vary of course, but the developers list a GTX 1050 as the minimum requirement for 1080p 60 in the lower settings, making it a highly accessible title in terms of hardware. I'd like to also highlight the overall quality of the PC port, as it has a highly customizable settings menu with just about everything I would ask for, including native ultrawide support, an FOV slider, and fully rebindable controls. The only conspicuous absence is the lack of upscaling support, which is a shame as any of the current hardware upscalers would likely do a far better job at smoothing over the jaggies in this game when compared to TAA. By the way, I'm far from a TAA hater, but I highly recommend you disable it while playing Trails, as it leads to some noticeable transparency artifacts and ghosting, especially when panning the camera around Olivier for some reason. In a market where remakes often fail to recapture the soul of their respective original works, Trails in the Sky the First Chapter shines as an example that all remakes should aspire to. The newfound dynamism of the combat system, the sheer joy of seeing Liberal and all of its denizens faithfully recreated in a modern engine, of inhabiting those spaces not as an all-seeing overhead god but in a much more intimate third-person view, being able to look up and watch as an airship passes by, hearing the characters talk, bicker and emote in ways the original game, as good looking as it may have been, never would, far outweighs any minor criticism I may have had. It may not be perfect, but the way Falcom managed to preserve the classic story and characters I love while propelling the presentation to new heights easily qualifies the remake as the definitive starting point for new players and a fine nostalgia trip for us veterans. I'm now eagerly waiting for the second chapter's release, and most of you will too when you finish this game.